There is a reason Rome never described Cleopatra's final days in detail. Not because the records were lost, but because what happened to her followed the law. By the time Cleopatra understood that Rome would not let her live, there were no chains on her wrists, no guards inside her chamber, no blade raised in threat, and yet she was already trapped. Every visitor was approved, every message filtered, every promise delivered in words designed to be withdrawn later. History says Cleopatra chose death to preserve her dignity, but that story begins too late. Before the asp, before the legend, Rome removed every other option first, quietly, methodically, and without ever drawing blood. Rome did not conquer by chaos. It conquered by turning defeat into a process. When a city fell, Rome did not only take gold, it took names, bloodlines, symbols, anything that could become a future rallying point. That is why queens were dangerous. A dead queen could become a legend. A living queen could become a banner. So Rome developed a method that looked merciful on the surface. No public torture, no screaming crowds, no sudden execution. Instead, containment. They controlled who she could see, what she could send, what she could hear. They allowed negotiations that were never meant to end in freedom. They offered terms that sounded generous, until you noticed how easily they could be revoked. And when Rome needed a woman erased, it did not always use a knife. It used time, days of waiting with no certainty, days of watching doors open for Roman officials, then close again. Days where every silence became a message. You have no leverage left. Cleopatra understood this language, because Rome wasn't speaking to her as a queen anymore. It was speaking to her as a file, a remaining variable, a political risk. And risks in Rome were not argued with. They were managed. At first, the Romans called it diplomacy, a meeting, a message, a promise, carried in polite language. But Cleopatra quickly learned what these visits truly were. They were inspections. Each time a Roman official entered her space, he was not there to listen. He was there to measure what remained of her authority, who still served her, who still feared her, who still believed she could change the outcome. And then slowly, Rome began to remove those pieces. A trusted aide was reassigned for questioning and never returned. A servant who had been with her for years was suddenly replaced by someone new, someone who watched too closely and spoke too little. Corridors that once belonged to the palace became Roman corridors, with Roman footsteps, Roman schedules, Roman permission. Cleopatra was not being beaten, she was being edited. Rome did not need to humiliate her in public. It needed her to understand, privately, that her world was shrinking. Every day brought another delay disguised as a decision, another offer that sounded like mercy until you read the conditions, another pause, long enough to make hope feel childish. And the cruelest part was that none of it looked cruel. No blood on the floor, no screams, only the steady rhythm of a system doing what it was built to do. By the time Cleopatra realized the negotiations were simply a way to keep her alive, until she stopped being useful, she was already alone inside the outcome, not defeated by an army, defeated by administration. The moment did not arrive with shouting. It arrived the way Roman decisions often did, quietly, delivered through a sentence that sounded harmless until you understood what it meant. A Roman official entered with the same calm posture, the same measured voice, the same scrolls. He spoke of arrangements, of security, of Rome's respect for her position. Then came the detail that didn't belong, a reference to where she would be taken next. Not if she would go, but when. Not as a guest, not as a negotiating partner, as cargo. Cleopatra had heard enough to recognize the shape of the future. A ship, a guarded residence, a long route west, and, finally, Rome. Not to be killed, to be displayed. A queen reduced to evidence, a living footnote in Octavian's triumph, walking behind his chariot, while the crowd screamed for a spectacle they would never understand. Rome didn't need her dead. It needed her powerless, in public, and once that future became clear, everything in the palace changed. The silence stopped feeling neutral. It became a countdown. Every hour that passed was another door closing. Every delay was no longer a negotiation tactic. It was Rome giving her time to accept what had already been decided. Cleopatra did not panic. She did something far colder. She began to plan for the only form of control Rome could not sign, seal, and revoke. Cleopatra did not announce anything. There was no speech, no outburst, no dramatic collapse. That would have given Rome something it could use. A weakness to document, a panic to justify harsher measures. Instead, she returned to stillness. She allowed the Romans to believe she was adapting, that she was bargaining, that she was waiting for mercy like everyone else eventually did. But inside her chambers, the tone changed. She began to reduce her world on purpose. Fewer servants, fewer visitors, fewer sounds. Only the people she trusted enough to be silent. The Romans noticed, of course. They always noticed. But what could they accuse her of? Praying, resting, preparing her wardrobe for the journey. Rome's power was built on controlling visible actions, on stamping permission onto movements, letters, meetings. It was not built to control a private decision made behind a closed door. Cleopatra understood the final cruelty of the situation. Rome would not kill her, because death would end the story too cleanly. Rome wanted her alive long enough to be reduced in public, long enough to become a lesson. So Cleopatra began preparing the only ending Octavian could not parade. Quietly, methodically, with the same discipline Rome used against her. And while Roman guards stood outside her chamber, watching for weapons, watching for allies, watching for rebellion, Cleopatra prepared for something far smaller, something that required no army, no messenger, no negotiation, only a moment of privacy. Only a single breath. It happened without warning, not because Cleopatra was careless, but because Rome was confident. A guard outside her door heard nothing unusual, no struggle, no raised voice, no sudden footsteps. Inside, the palace air remained the same. Warm lamplight, still curtains, stone that held the day's heat. Cleopatra's attendants moved carefully, speaking only when necessary, as if loud words could summon the future too quickly. When a Roman official arrived to check on her condition, he brought routine with him. The same tone, the same measured questions, the same assumption that time belonged to Rome. But the room did not feel like a prisoner's room. It felt like an ending that had already begun. Cleopatra sat composed, dressed with deliberate simplicity. No desperate elegance, no performance, only control. The official spoke as if the decision could still be adjusted, as if Cleopatra still needed to be guided toward acceptance. He offered reassurance with the careless generosity of someone who never expected to be refused. Cleopatra listened, and then she gave him something Rome did not know how to process. Closure. Not in the form of agreement, not in the form of surrender, but in the form of a private choice that made Rome's timetable irrelevant. Outside the chamber, guards remained at their posts, watching for weapons, watching for escape, watching for rebellion. They never thought to watch for silence. And when the door finally opened again, the truth would arrive the way Roman truths often did, too late, too official, and already irreversible. They did not rush in at first. Rome never rushed, not when it believed it still owned the timeline. A guard noticed the quiet had lasted too long, not the ordinary quiet of a controlled prisoner, but the kind that feels sealed. A Roman official returned with routine questions and an impatient tone. He expected delays, excuses, another round of careful words. Instead, the chamber offered nothing back. When the door finally opened, the scene did not look like a tragedy. It looked like order. The attendants stood frozen, faces pale, eyes lowered, as if sound itself had become dangerous. And Cleopatra, once a queen who had moved empires, was now still in a way Rome could not negotiate with. For a moment, the Romans simply stared, because this was the one outcome Octavian could not display, could not script, could not turn into a clean symbol of dominance. There would be no triumphal procession with a living queen. No public reduction, no controlled humiliation to teach the provinces what resistance earned, only a corpse and a problem. Rome's first response was not grief, not anger, it was procedure, confirm, Record. Secure the room. Question the attendants. Search for objects that could be blamed, explained, categorized. Rome did not ask what she felt. Rome asked how she did it. Because how could be written down, sealed, and sent to Octavian as a report. And even in death, Cleopatra was handled the same way she had been handled in life, as an administrative risk to be contained. Quietly, quickly, and without allowing the story to belong to her. By the time the report reached the highest office, the room had already been cleaned of meaning. Not cleaned like a crime scene, cleaned like a mistake. Orders moved faster than grief ever could. Witnesses were separated, statements were shaped. Loose details were trimmed until the event fit into something Rome could control. Because a queen dying behind a closed door was not just an ending, it was a threat. A living captive could be displayed. A living captive could be turned into a lesson. But a private choice, made in silence, refused the empire its spectacle. So Rome did what it always did when a story slipped out of its grasp. It replaced it. A simple version, tidy enough to repeat. A version that sounded inevitable. A version that made the conqueror look unshaken and the conquered look already finished. And soon, the palace became background noise. The sealed doors became footnotes. The attendants became unnamed. The procedures became invisible. What remained was a myth, polished and portable. Not to honor her, to keep the empire from looking vulnerable to silence. Because Rome could defeat armies, but it could not defeat a decision made in private. So it did the next best thing. It wrote over her. Rome would later speak of the Queen's end as if it had been expected, as if it had been controlled, as if the empire had guided every step. That is what empires do when something slips past their hands. They rewrite the escape as compliance. They turn a private decision into a public inevitability. They dress uncertainty in confident language and call it history. And for centuries, that version held. A queen reduced to a cautionary tale. A final moment turned into entertainment. Her name carried forward as rumor, romance, and spectacle. Anything except what her final days actually were. Containment. Because her story was never just about death. It was about how power behaves when it doesn't need to shout. How it isolates instead of tortures. How it delays instead of threatens. How it replaces violence with process and calls it order. Rome could conquer cities. It could break armies. It could bend kings. But in the end, it could not force a woman to live long enough to be displayed. So it did what it always did afterward. It controlled the narrative. And that may be the darkest part. Not that she died, but that an empire believed the real victory was deciding what you were allowed to remember.